Good morning, everyone. My name is Irene Yu. I'm your MC for today. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. On behalf of CrossCulture Church, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you today to this RoundTable Symposium on Creations. RoundTable is a ministry of CrossCulture Church. Our mission is to discover truth one question at a time. So today we're honored to have Dr. Louise Johns and Dr. Martin Williams to present a much anticipated topic on handling the creation-evolution conflict. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes of your time. A brief overview of today's running order. In the morning, our speaker will cover the doctrine of creation with their perspective on young earth and long age. We will have presentations from each of the speakers for about 30 minutes to 40 minutes. Hopefully they won't run over time. Once both speakers have presented their talk, we will have a time of deliberations and followed by Q&A. So please submit your questions by texting to the phone number on the screen. Now, due to logistics, we will only respond to questions that's coming through the text. After the lunch break, we will cover science and Christianity, looking at how you fit scripture and science together. A little bit of housekeeping. So the toilets are on the left as I'm facing the entrance. And also please turn your phone to silent mode. While it is not compulsory, we do encourage everyone to put on your mask while you're in the building. And also lunch will be provided at 12:30 and will resume at 1:30 for the afternoon session. Now, today is not about a debate. Today is about understanding. And understanding on the doctrine of creation. And we hoped you will be equipped to consider the issues from both a long age perspective and from a young age earth perspective. Some of you have come with a long age view and some with young earth view. You will probably have lived here with the same view. What you will gain from today is a better understanding of the positions that you take and a better understanding of how other people think. And hopefully, you will be better able to engage and relate to your fellow Christians. There will be plenty of food for thoughts. However, we will not be able to solve all the world's problems here today. You will go away and reflect and think for yourself. The New Testament shows that Christians are expected to be able to judge the opinions of the expert and to be able to test against the scripture. So there are important issues at stake in this discussion. The differences are important. So today you'll get plenty of opportunity to practice the new creation features by bearing with one another over important differences. And what is important is how we treat each other through these differences with respect, and we'll be able to embrace the diversity of thought. Now, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Martin Williams. Dr. Martin teaches a few blocks away from here at Reformed Theological College, where he is head of theology. He started life in New Zealand, and he has worked as a missionary in Cameroon, West Africa, and as a pastor in a Presbyterian church. His doctoral dissertation on salvation in 1 Peter was published by Cambridge University Press. He's also an editor of the journal Vox Reformata. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Martin to the podium and to explain the scriptures from a young earth perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you for the 30 to 40 minutes leeway there. I'm very grateful. And thank you to you and to CrossCulture for hosting this important event. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers and sisters, colleagues and friends, thank you for coming out today. Thank you for giving up your Saturday to come and join in this discussion on this really important topic. I'd also like to thank Dr. Lewis Jones. I'm just going to call you Lewis. If I call you Dr. Jones, I'm going to feel a bit like I'm in an Indiana Jones movie. So thanks for being willing to join in this important discussion today. I mean, this is, I think as Irene pointed out, this is an in-house discussion, if you like, between two brothers in Christ who love the Lord Jesus Christ, whose consciences are captive to the Word of God, as Martin Luther once put it so well, and who would like to invite you to listen in on our conversation and think about how we can engage this discussion as brothers and sisters in Christ, not as opponents, not as enemies, I hope, but as brothers and sisters who have been redeemed together in Christ. I'm just going to change glasses, and I'm going to thank Duan up there who's going to do my slides for me because I can't see the screen. So thanks, Duan, for trying to keep up. Well, in their book, Living at the Crossroads, Michael Goheen and Craig Bartholomew invite us to see that we live at the crossroads of two stories, the biblical story and the Western story, each largely incompatible with each other, and both which claim to be all-embracing. As the missiologist Leslie Newbegin writes, he says, in our contemporary culture, two quite different stories are told. One is the story of evolution, of the development of the species through the survival of the strong. The other is the one embodied in the Bible, the story of creation and fall, of God's election of a people to be the bearers of his purpose for humankind, and of the coming of the one in whom that purpose is to be fulfilled. These are two different and incompatible stories. So the question we're asking then is, how can we as Christians live at these crossroads? Well, the answer is it depends on which of these stories is held to be the one true story of our world. The question is whether our faith will find its focus in Jesus and the Gospels as the key to understanding our world and our world's history, whether we will embrace the cultural story as true, the secular story, and surrender to the pressure to limit our faith to the sort of private realm of mere religion. As Goheen and Bartholomew point out, if the church is faithful and committed to the proclamation of the gospel, there's going to be a missionary encounter, a clash between the biblical story and our secular Western cultural story. And since both stories are comprehensive and all-embracing, and since both claim to be true, such an encounter, such a clash, is going to be inevitable. However, if the Bible accepts the secular Western cultural story as the one true story of our world and its history, then it will be obliged to tailor the gospel to fit somewhere within our cultural story. Leslie Newbegin believed that the church had deeply compromised the gospel by allowing the biblical story to be absorbed into the modern, Western, secular, atheistic, scientific story. He spoke of the Western Christianity as being an advanced case of syncretism, having accepted the fusing together of two largely incompatible stories. Newbegin believed that the church must recover the gospel on its own terms as the one, only, and true and comprehensive story of our world. So the question is, how can we recover the gospel on its own terms? Well, Jesus provided an example of how this can be done in Luke chapter 24 and verse 27. We read, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Here, inside the Bible, we find the true meaning of who Jesus is and what he came to do. When Jesus came, he stepped into a long story of God's redemptive history, God's redemptive work in history that had been unfolding for thousands of years. And when he came, he announced that he himself was the climax of this redemptive story, the climax of God's redemptive activity. And so the identity of Jesus Christ and the nature of his saving work can only be understood correctly when it's viewed in light of the whole biblical story. In particular, we need to keep in mind that the gospel sits within the larger narrative that has the following basic movement: creation, fall, curse, that's God's judgment resulting in death and disease among humans, the cross, the death of Christ that lifts the curse, and the consummation, the complete removal of the effects of the curse in the new heavens and the new earth. And it's only within this narrative, within this story, that we can understand the true meaning of history and the true meaning of the central event of history, the cross of Jesus Christ. And therefore, tampering with that storyline will inevitably lead to a distorted picture of that event and its significance. However, if one accepts the evolutionary story as the true story of our world and the true story of history, the Bible forfeits its claim to be the one true, comprehensive story of the world. And it's held captive within another story. And as a result, it's that other story that will shape our understanding of history. It's that other story that will shape our understanding of the gospel. You see, one of the fundamental ways in which the evolutionary story of history has fundamentally shaped the way we understand the cross has been the way that it's changed our understanding of the pre-fall world. It has relocated death and disease to before the fall, no longer viewing them as a consequence of the fall, but as the very mechanism of creation, or what's often known as evolutionary creation. The story is reconceived in light of the evolutionary understanding of origins. We now have creation through evolution via death, disease, mutation, natural selection. Then we have the emergence of humans via evolution. Then the fall, which is spiritual only. The curse, which is a spiritual curse only. The cross, which brings about spiritual salvation only. And the consummation, which is really just an improvement on the first creation, not a restoration of it. And so you can see one of the consequences of this altered storyline is that the penalty for sin is only spiritual death and not also physical death. And so when the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 5 and verse 12 that just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, death is interpreted as being only spiritual death. This position is quite typical among theistic evolutionists. For example, Dr. Chris Moheran, the executive director of Australia's largest theistic evolutionary organisation, ISCAST, explains this position. He writes, if death has been part of the story of life on Earth since it began, then evolutionary creation must affirm that the death resulting from the fall was not biological death. Similarly, Dr. Dennis Alexander, a molecular biologist and former head of UK's largest evolutionary organisation for Christians, writes this. He says, nowhere in the Old Testament is there the slightest suggestion that physical death of either animals or humans after a reasonable span of years is anything other than the normal pattern ordained by God for this earth. But I wonder if you can see the problem with this position. If the penalty for sin is only spiritual death, then I submit to you that Jesus' physical death on the cross and physical resurrection from the grave is both redundant. There's no need for a physical death if the penalty for sin is only spiritual death. And it's absolutely senseless. Jesus' physical death in and of itself achieves absolutely nothing. It pays no debt. It pays no penalty, because physical death is not the penalty for sin. However, as 1 Peter 1:24 informs us, Peter writes that he, Christ himself, bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. The words there, he bore our sins on the tree, means he suffered the consequences or the punishment that our sins deserved. While the words in his body and by his wounds indicate the bodily nature of his suffering, as he suffers the due penalty for our sins. As Peter points out in the next chapter, in chapter 3 and verse 18, he was put to death in the flesh. Peter wants to emphasize that. Friends, the biblical writers wrote in order to give their readers absolute certainty regarding the things of which they wrote. Luke tells Theophilus at the start of his gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 3 to 4, he says, "It seemed good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." The word certainty there indicates the absolute certainty and truthfulness of the report concerning the history and the work of Jesus Christ. This is his whole reason for writing. Theophilus knew about Jesus, but he needed to know for sure. And such certainty requires not only that your interpretation of Jesus' death is a true interpretation, a true understanding, but that you can also know that it is true. One's interpretation is not true unless it conforms to the apostles' interpretation of the cross. The apostolic understanding of the cross is the sole standard of truth. However, you cannot know that it's true unless your New Testament interpretation is reliable in the first place. You can have no certainty if you only believe the not disproven parts first. You can have no certainty if you only believe the parts you want to believe. And if the New Testament interpretation is clear, then you would expect that that interpretation or that understanding is standard church teaching. So let's apply what I'm saying. So what do we find? Well, when we find that when the early church considered the biblical teaching on the creation, fall, death, and the cross, the church affirmed that Adam's physical death came about due to sin and was not a part of the natural world. For example, this is reaffirmed in Canon 1 of the Council of Carthage in AD 418. And then again in Canon 1 of the Council of Orange in AD 529. This is also affirmed and reaffirmed in the Protestant confessions of the 16th and 17th centuries. So clearly you don't decide that spiritual death alone is a consequence of the fall and sin if your thinking framework begins with a biblical understanding of what the cross achieved. But if your thinking begins with the evolutionary story, then it makes perfect sense to say that physical death has nothing to do with sin. According to the evolutionary story, physical death is simply a part of nature as God designed it. In fact, it's an essential part of nature, as we'll see after lunch. Indeed, it's one of the most important parts of the evolutionary process, because evolution depends on the survival of the fittest. According to the evolutionary story, death has been here on this planet since the beginning of life millions of years ago. And so physical death cannot be a result of sin if you start with the evolutionary story. So here's the first thing we see then when we start with a New Testament understanding of the cross. Christ's physical death on the cross and physical resurrection from the grave demands that physical death is a consequence of human sin and not creation as God ordained it. So that's the first thing we see. We see that Jesus died on the cross to bear the consequences of our sin. But secondly, it's interesting to note that this is not the only place in the New Testament where we see that Jesus died to bear something for us. In the second place, we see that Jesus died to bear our sicknesses and our illnesses and our diseases. After recording a whole number of healings, in Matthew 8:16-17, we read this. That evening they brought to Jesus many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and he healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and he bore our diseases. Now, long-age evolutionary story tells us that these illnesses and diseases were around long before modern humans appeared on the scene. For instance, less evolved precursors to early humans, i.e. early hominins, suffered many of the same diseases that modern humans do, such as osteomyelitis, tuberculosis, bacteria causing tuberculosis, bone cancer, various developmental abnormalities, and so on. And I've documented all these in a published article on the Creation Ministries table at the back there. And there I show that according to evolutionary scientists, evidence for disease and abnormalities in the human fossil record date back almost 2 million years, according to an evolutionary dating. For as Mary Benton, assistant professor of bioinformatics at Baylor University, points out, genetic disease is a necessary product of evolution. Dennis Alexander tells us that I discovered that dinosaurs were suffering from osteomyelitis, that's an inflammation of the bones, more than 65 million years before the fall. That viruses and bacteria have been endemic for billions of years. And that genetic variation in DNA meant that aging, death, and disease have always been present in living things. Now, with a long-age evolutionary framework, our species, Homo sapiens, dates back to approximately 120,000 years ago, according to most scientists. So unless we believe that Adam belonged to a different species to us, the earliest possible date for Adam is approximately 120,000 years ago. Furthermore, if illness, disease, and the human fossil record can be traced back almost 2 million years ago, then we have the problem of human disease and sickness predating the fall by at least 1.8 million years. So even if you reject evolution and say that Adam was a special creation of God, but keep long ages, you're still going to have the same issue. Now, if this long age story of our world is true, then there are two consequences. Number one, it completely changes the shape of the gospel. If cancer, tuberculosis, osteomyelitis, and other human diseases and abnormalities were present before the fall, as the evolutionary story maintains, then they were a part of the original creation, And so according to Matthew 8:17, Jesus had to die sin or no sin because of how we were created. Even if Adam never sinned, Jesus would still have needed to die to bear our diseases, as Matthew 8:17 says he did. But the Bible insists that this is simply not true. Rather, it insists that it was due to our fault and not God's fault that Jesus died. Indeed, one of the main purposes of the doctrine of original sin is to safeguard the claim that Jesus' death is on account of what we have done, not what God has done. Secondly, it rewrites the gospel story to say that Jesus died to redeem us from good things, because disease and sickness has been around for as long as life itself. And one of the central points of Genesis chapter 1 is that God declared his creation good. In fact, very good. Genesis 1:31. 7 times. It's an important point. So if ever there was a very good creation, then according to the evolutionary story, in Matthew 8:17, Jesus died to save us from good things, because God declared diseases to be very good things since they were a part of his original creation. The gospel message then, according to the long-age story, is that Jesus died to save us from good things: death, disease, sickness, and illness. So you can see that the gospel collapses if creation is bad. This is why the evolutionary story cannot be allowed to reshape and reframe the biblical story. It rejects the biblical shape of the gospel story: creation, fall, curse, death and disease, cross, consummation. And it reshapes the gospel story in the following way: creation by death and disease, fall, spiritual, cross, curse, spiritual, cross, spiritual, consummation. This is why Christians have almost uniformly believed that disease entered as a result of the fall, at least up to the 19th century. D.A. Carson, for example, writes in his commentary on Matthew 8:17, both Scripture and Jewish tradition take sickness as resulting directly or indirectly from living in a fallen world. The Messianic age would end such grief. Therefore, Jesus' miracles, dealing with every kind of ailment, not only herald the kingdom, but show that God has pledged himself to deal with sin at a basic level. Again, this has been the standard teaching of the church because it accurately embodies the apostolic preaching of the cross. So here's the second point that comes from starting our thinking with the apostolic preaching of the cross. Because Jesus died to bear our sicknesses and our diseases, according to Matthew 8:17, disease could not have been around before the fall, as the long-age evolutionary story claims. Then finally, thirdly, Jesus died to bear the consequences of our sin. Jesus died to bear our sicknesses and our illnesses. We're getting widening out now. Now we see the comprehensive nature of his work of redemption. Jesus now dies, we see, to redeem all of creation. Now, in order to reconcile these two claims, that disease was around before humans, but that human disease did not enter into the human experience until after the fall, some theologians, generally not scientists, adopt a quarantine strategy. They speculate that Adam and Eve were quarantined off from the rest of creation. They were kept apart from the rest of creation to keep them safe from sickness, disease, and so on. That way you can have a creation that's filled with all those things that Jesus died to save us from, death and disease, but they were not a part of the human experience until after the fall. Dr. Andrew Leslie, a lecturer at Moore Theological College in Sydney, writes this. He says, "But unlike us, who cannot but sin and die, Adam was created free from this sentence to enjoy the possibility of an everlasting relationship with God. His physical and spiritual mortality was a direct result of his sin. When God created the first humans, he did so in a way that quarantined their initial existence from the inevitability of physical decay, disease, entropy, and death. All these things are a distortion for which Adam is responsible." Notice that he's careful to say here that death and disease, at least in the human experience, are a result of sin and not creation. Because he knows that if he locates death and disease to before the fall, such a move will collapse the gospel. So in order to reconcile the evolutionary story with the biblical story, Leslie is forced to insert a local miracle into the biblical story. He speculates that if Adam and Eve were quarantined off from the rest of creation, that in some way the Garden of Eden would be a safe place from a world full of death, disease, decay, and destruction. However, I submit to you that this approach makes no sense, scientifically or biblically. Firstly, nowhere in Scripture do we find this idea that the Garden of Eden was a protected zone in the midst of a dangerous and scary world. Secondly, to suggest that Adam and Eve were immune from the death and the disease that surrounded them is to claim that they are immune from the God-ordained and observable biological laws of nature. In the end, it's unsatisfying scientifically. Thirdly, a local miracle would in the end be ineffective, given God's command in Genesis 1:28, where God says to Adam and Eve, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Get out of your bubble. "And subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." At some stage, Adam and Eve, or at least their descendants, would have to leave the garden, would have to leave their bubble if they were to remain obedient to God's mandate. Under the evolutionary story, a local miracle still leaves death and disease inevitable for Adam and Eve, at least for their descendants, sin or no sin. Under this scenario, Jesus had to die because of the way that God created the world. But if you opt for a local miracle, then you get a situation that looks very Gnostic. It means that creation is bad, God's creation is still the source of death, disease, and decay, and Jesus still dies to free us from creation. Secondly, people fall into nature. At the fall, we become natural, subject to death and disease like the rest of creation. And thirdly, we are saved twice. Adam and Eve are first saved when they're put into their garden bubble, and they're saved a second time when Jesus dies on the cross to bear their sicknesses and their diseases. So there are two basic problems with this view. Number one, as I said, it's scientifically unsatisfying. It would mean that Adam would have to be quarantined from and preserved against the biology of his own DNA, which has death woven into it, according to the long-age evolutionary story. No scientist would accept such an explanation. And secondly, it's biblically unsatisfying. It does not fit with the story of the Bible. In the Bible, we are taught not that we are saved from creation, but rather that we are saved together with creation, the whole of creation, which is subject to the curse of the fall. So in Romans 8:19 to 21, the Apostle Paul writes, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So here's the third thing that comes from starting our thinking with an apostolic understanding of the cross. Jesus died to redeem all of creation, because the whole of creation, not just Adam and Eve, has been affected by sin. He doesn't need to die to fix a creation mistake. So to conclude, here are three claims about the cross that mean different things depending on what story they are a part of: the biblical story or the long-age evolutionary story. According to the long-age evolutionary story, Jesus died to bear, when we talked about Jesus dying to bear our sins, we noted that physical death does not come from sin but from creation. According to the biblical story, we argue that physical death is the penalty of sin, and that's why Jesus had to die a physical death and rise a physical body. Then we talked about how Jesus died to bear our sickness. According to the long-age evolutionary story, we saw that the world was created filled with things that Jesus died to save us from: death, disease, and decay. However, we saw that according to the biblical story, the original creation was good. Death, disease, and decay are a result of the fall, and that is why Jesus died to bear our diseases. And then thirdly, we saw that Jesus died to redeem all of creation. According to the evolutionary story, being natural, becoming like the rest of nature, is God's punishment for us. According to the biblical story, all of creation has been affected by the fall, not just Adam and Eve, and will be redeemed along with God's people. So I submit to you then in conclusion that young earth biblical creation, which we're going to define a bit later on, has to be true if the New Testament presentation of the meaning and significance of Jesus' death is to be believed. The long-age evolutionary Jesus was not only slain for those whose names were written in the Lamb's Book of Life before the foundation of the world, but he was also slain for the foundation of the world. He died because of how God made the world. Young earth biblical creation, on the other hand, I submit to you, acknowledges that Jesus died to redeem us from sin and its effects on us and all of creation, and therefore upholds the goodness of creation, the intrusiveness of sin, and the disastrous effects that sin has had on God's good creation. And it upholds the glory of the cross, which redeems us not from creation, but rather redeems us together with creation from its bondage to sin and its devastating effects. So, my friends, understanding why Jesus died is of first importance. And if we look to the clear teaching of Scripture to understand it, then as we've just seen, that means rejecting the evolutionary story. It's worth contending for a scriptural understanding of why Jesus died, even if it means being ridiculed. Please don't be embarrassed by the foolishness of the cross. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Spot on, 35 minutes. Impressive. Well done. Yes, I can see. Now, remember, friends, please text your questions to these numbers on the screen. Yep. So for Dr. Martin to address your questions during the Q&A sessions. Now, friends, hopefully that has helped you understand how the young earth thinking works. Now, to present a different perspective, a long-age perspective, we have Dr. Louis Johns. Louis ministered on university campuses with Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students, leading the Simeon Network, a network of Christians working in academia. He holds a PhD in astrophysics and a degree in theology from Moore Theological College. Louis is a member of the Gospel Society and Culture Committee of the Presbyterian Church of New South Wales. He served on the University of New South Wales Human Research Ethics Committee, is a regular columnist with the Centre for Christian Apologetic Scholarship and Education, CAS Quarterly, and is a fellow of ISCAST, Christians in Science and Technology. Louis is married to Jenny, has 3 children, and is an elder at Randwick Presbyterian Church. So please join me in welcome Dr. Louis to the podium to explain the scripture from the long-age perspective. Over to you, Louis.
Now, do I need to do anything to this microphone? Lift it up or anything like that, or everyone's happy? Okay. Am I getting, all right, anyway, you can tell me if there's a problem. Well, thanks very much. We do want it up. Okay, that's fine. I will do that. Okay, is that maybe going to sound a little bit better? Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you to CrossCulture. It's a thrill to be here. It's always great to be in Melbourne, and it's great to be among you today. To be thinking about the Bible. That's what I love to do. Thank you to Irene as well. She's organized us very well. Thank you to Martin. An excellent talk we've just heard. This is an in-house discussion, as he has told us, and it can be conducted with love for each other, as our Lord Jesus Christ has told us. Martin's already given us a good example of having that discussion in love calmly, and I hope I can rise to that occasion. My slides, however, will not even come close to rising to the level of Martin's slides, but I have no idea how he does it. But I stand in awe. But I have tried to follow Martin's injunction to let the Bible speak for itself as much as possible and let the Bible interpret the Bible for us. So let's get going. The Creation Week is important. It's the introduction to the greatest story ever told, as we say, and our understanding of Creation Week will, of course, impact our understanding of that story. And when I say Creation Week, from here on in, what I mean is the text of Genesis 1:1 through to Genesis 2, verse 3. Now, the text of Creation Week is packed with all sorts of features and interesting nuggets, and like any passage of the Bible, it's a rich vein of God's truth to be mined and applied to our lives today. The reason that I want to talk about Creation Week with you today, though, is because this section of the Bible has been something of a fault line in the debates around the relationship of what the Bible teaches on the one hand and the presumed discoveries of science about our world on the other. And often discussions center around whether Creation Week is itself an historical and scientific account of the first 7 days of the history of the universe, or some kind of figurative account of origins that touches really on the nature of our world only theologically. Now, pardon me, I just realized I'm not doing a good job here. All right, let's see how that goes. Well, okay, so it is really important to understand the nature of Creation Week because it determines the shape of theological history, as Martin's already showed us. Typically, both the historical and figurative interpretations of Creation Week assume it is discussing origins. And that's, of course, not surprising, given its position in the canon, but also the content of the text. But that assumption means we read the shape of history something like this. And again, as Martin's already pointed out, it's good at the point of Creation Week, it goes bad at the sin of Adam, and it's perfected in Christ, or it gets better or something. That's the framework into which most discussions attempt to fit the evidence they bring to the table about Creation Week. And you've gotten ahead of me now and have worked out that what I'm about to say then is that I think there could be possibly be a different framework for this. So that's what the content of my talk is going to be, is a new look at Creation Week. Buckle your seatbelts, because this is going to be a fairly wild and rapid ride through the Bible to look at sort of one possible view of Creation Week. All right, so this is my proposal, and I will be arguing for this for the rest of the talk. The story of the Bible is the in-time revelation of God's eternal plan depicted in Creation Week. The story of the Bible is the in-time revelation of God's eternal plan depicted in Creation Week. So I've picked out three sort of premises, in a sense, contained in this proposal that I'm going to need to demonstrate to you, I think, in order to persuade you of the whole thing. Here they are, and I will work through them in this order. First of all, God has an eternal plan. Secondly, Creation Week is narratively distinct from what follows in Genesis 2, verse 4. And thirdly, Creation Week itself is an out-of-time prologue, I'll explain that a little bit later, depicting God's eternal plan. And then, of course, having persuaded you of this, we will then need to explore the implications of it for creation, evolution, and the gospel of Jesus. But without further ado, then, let's get started on the first point. God has an eternal plan. There has only ever been a plan A for the history of our universe. Ephesians 1 says it like this: "In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will." With the God of the Bible, there is no plan B. God is not surprised by anything such that he needs to make a course correction in mid-flight. Whatever God planned before the creation of the world is what happened in the history of the world. The Bible is the revelation of how God's eternal plan A worked itself out in time. One implication of this truth is that we will not read the Bible with a mind to figure out what was good and what was bad, where things went wrong and how God corrected for it. We will read the Bible in the expectation that every twist and turn and act of righteousness and rebellion is the story of Plan A. Okay, now from theory to practice, let's make a short list of features of God's Plan A that we can discern from the Bible. I realize that with my description of Plan A, that means everything in the Bible is a part of Plan A, so I could pick anything. But for our purposes this morning, I'm going to restrict myself to the kinds of things that the New Testament says have been determined at or before the foundation of the world, or were foreknown, or were predestined. Okay, so here's a picture of a nugget from Plan A. You can see here that we've been redeemed, verse 19, with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. Verse 20, he was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Or a similar point there from Acts 4, indeed Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles, and so on and so on. Verse 28, they did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. There are other verses that give us this exact same picture, but point one of Plan A, Jesus was chosen to be sacrificed on the cross for the sins of the elect before the creation of the world. Okay, another nugget from Plan A, Ephesians 1:9. Verse 12 and 10, he made known to us the mystery of his will to be put into effect when the times have reached their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ. So another point from Plan A is that God's will was to bring everything in heaven and earth together under Christ. And we will keep going for another couple of points. earlier in chapter 1 of Ephesians, he chose us in him before the creation of the world. So there's that phrase, to be holy and blameless. He predestined us to be adopted as sons or children. In him we have redemption through his blood, forgiveness of sins. And so point 3, God's elect were chosen to be adopted, redeemed, and forgiven through the death of Jesus Christ. And the last point is Romans 8:29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined, again, to be conformed to the image of his Son. And so the last point for our little survey is God's elect were predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. All right, so there's a snapshot of Plan A and some of the events that were always going to happen. Now, God is by no means the author of sin, but sin was part of Plan A. God the Son asks God the Father to release him from drinking the cup of the wrath of God in the place of rebellious humanity. But Jesus dying for our sin is part of Plan A. It is not Plan B. There has never been any other plan. These truths have been part of the plan from before the creation of the world. So there, God has a Plan A. Now, my next point is that Creation Week is narratively distinct from what follows in Genesis 2, verse 4. I guess I could express this idea that Creation Week and what follows, they don't dovetail together nicely. One narrative doesn't flow into the other, and there are 4 different lines of evidence that help convince me of this idea, that Creation Week is distinct, is narratively distinct from what follows in Genesis 2, verse 4. And these are the 4 lines of evidence. The 7th day of Creation Week, the way the Bible seems to point back to Genesis 2, verse 4 as the beginning of the story. There's a missing image of God after Genesis 1, and then there's some other elements of sort of ambiguity about the world of Genesis 2 and 3 that make us wonder whether it really is the same world, that completed good world of Genesis 1. So anyway, let's take a look at the 7th day then. One of the most significant points in relation to the distinction between Creation Week and the narrative of biblical history is that the 7th day has no end. We all know this. Throughout Creation Week, the patterns of each day have dominated the sense of timing and movement and structure of the passage. As you can see some examples on the screen. The exceptions to those patterns are also easily noted. They jump out of the page at you, and both the patterns and exceptions communicate to us as readers. They're purposeful, and their purpose is not usually difficult to discern. In the case of the 7th day, the lack of evening and morning is telling us something. Here is God at rest in his very good creation. God is not set to stop resting. It's all over. It's finished. The cosmic drama has reached its end. Time and history are therefore no longer relevant. There is no day 8. And interestingly, when we get a description of the new creation at the other end of the Bible, there is, in fact, no night. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there, or there will be no more night, says Revelation 22. This is already an indication that the entire story of our universe is actually contained in Creation Week. But the main point here is that there is no day 8. There is nowhere for the rest of history to fit into the timeline. It's already at an end. Okay, now let's take a look at this idea of the story of the Bible. And my contention is the story, the narrative arc of the Bible starts at Genesis 2, verse 4, and ends at Revelation 22. The first point I want to make is about a little Hebrew word called toledot. It's that word like the generations of, the family history of, that kind of word. And it crops up in almost every genealogy in the Bible, right through the Old Testament. But it provides a bit of a structure for the kind of unfolding of the narrative in the book of Genesis itself. And you can see some of the key figures there and the way it's used. But the interesting thing for our purposes is that it's not just about people. It's actually about the heavens and the earth as well. So the first occurrence of this is in Genesis 2, verse 4, and it's the account of the heavens and the earth. It's the family history of the heavens and the earth. But then the first words of the New Testament pick up that same Hebrew word translated into Greek, for the genealogy of Jesus. And so there's this little nod from the opening of the New Testament and the story of Jesus back to the beginning of what I would say is the story, the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story that ends with Jesus in Matthew's gospel. I won't spend time making too much of an argument here, but there is that verbal reference back to Genesis 2, verse 4 in Matthew's Gospel. There's a bit of numerological, genealogical magic that happens in Matthew's Gospel as well. You can ask a question about it if you want me to hold forth on that. But interestingly, at the end of Matthew's Gospel, in fact, at the end of chapter 1, at the end of genealogy, in Jesus' name, Emmanuel, God with us, and at the end of Matthew's Gospel, you get again, lo, I am with you always to the end of the age. There's this picture of the story that starts with this little Hebrew phrase in Genesis 2, verse 4, that ends with God dwelling with his people. And that's the story that Matthew says starts in Genesis 2, verse 4. It ends with Jesus, or God, dwelling with his people. And so there's this sense that is the beginning of the story. And the other part of this kind of story question and narrative arc is about the connection between Genesis 2 and Revelation, the end of Revelation 21 and 22. You get these comparisons, the imagery that you get in Revelation is garden imagery. It's not creation week imagery. And so you've got the gold and the precious stones of the new creation match the gold and the onyx of the garden, for example. Or similarly, the river is there and the tree of life is there. And on both accounts, in the garden and in Revelation, God is there present with his people. Okay, so that's my second line of evidence there that tells me that Creation Week is narratively distinct. Thirdly, there's this missing image of God. Jesus, it is clear in the New Testament that Jesus is the only human being who has ever been the perfect image of God. What does day 6 mean if it does not refer to either Jesus specifically, or at least perfected humanity more generally in Christ in the new creation? The Old Testament never describes any individual, including Adam, as being the image of God. Even in the genealogy of Adam in Genesis 5, he is the likeness of God, not the image. And when the New Testament swings around to this in James, again, humanity is said to be in the likeness of God, not in the image of God, whereas the rest of the New Testament tells us that Jesus is the image of God. But what the New Testament makes clear, not only that Jesus is the true image of God, but that God's people are in the present tense being conformed to the likeness of Christ. And so we are being transformed into the image of God, yes, now in Christ. But the point for Genesis 2 is that there was always work to be done. Adam was always provisional. Adam was always only ever the beginning of the story. Plan A always involved more than what we find in Genesis 2. And on that line, I'll take us to the last line of evidence, which is that the world of Genesis 2 throws up a whole bunch of ambiguous elements about it that make you wonder whether this really is the same world that was created one chapter earlier. And so here's just a summary of some of the evidence. some of my little ambiguous elements. Firstly, God says it's not good for Adam to be alone. But why does God ever create a situation that is not good? He fixes it, of course, but explicitly using the word good here in Genesis 2, as in the negative of it, there seems to be almost a purposeful insertion to make the reader think whether they really are living in the world of creation week of Genesis 1. Secondly, the presence of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why is it there? What purpose does it serve? What good purpose does it serve? We've already seen that that tree is missing in the new creation. Well, so why? The tree of life is in the new creation, but not the other one. Thirdly, the tempter is there in the garden. How is that part of a very good creation? Later we discover the tempter is Satan himself. Why is he there? What good purpose does that serve? Fourthly, God increases Eve's pain in childbearing in the curse. Well, that leaves me with the question, was there already pain in childbirth? Fifthly, the tree of life is required to stay alive. That's why God explicitly says he's kicking Adam and Eve out of the garden. He says otherwise they'd be able to eat the fruit of the tree of life and live forever. Right? That's why God kicks them out of the garden. That's the logic that God uses. But if the tree is required to stay alive, what's been happening outside the garden this whole time? There is a world out there, but what kind of world is it? Is it already this world of death without the tree of life? And all of the Bible doesn't say, and I'm not trying to say that it does say. My point is simply to say the world of Genesis 2 is just not the same picture of the world of creation week. The world of Genesis 2 is ambiguous rather than unambiguously good. Okay, so those are my 4 lines of evidence on this idea that that creation week is narratively distinct from Genesis 2, verse 4. Okay, and the last of my premises is this: creation week is an out-of-time prologue depicting God's eternal plan. And the proposal is this, really to tackle the question from the New Testament and say that the New Testament views creation week as an out-of-time prologue fulfilled in Jesus. And my contention is that if this is true, if the New Testament sees creation week as a sort of prologue that's fulfilled in Christ, then I would say that the precise relationship between creation week and the rest of the Bible, the timeline of history of the universe, will not actually affect our understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right, to the task at hand, the New Testament views creation week as an out-of-time prologue fulfilled in Jesus. I've already been arguing that creation week is a single picture of God's whole story, and the subsequent narrative of the Bible is the lived-out history of that picture. And the best way I think I can think of to illustrate this is with my running app. I don't go running very often, so this is not some kind of like virtue signaling and you're all meant to be, in awe of the fact that I exercise or something. I hardly do, but I do have a running app because I love data and things like that. But here is a recent run. Okay. But then, is it? What does that mean? How can there be a single picture of an event that is extended in time? You see, this is not a snapshot from my run. This is not one moment of my run. This is my run. A snapshot from my run would look something like that. That's the back of the club shed near the Oval at Milton Park in Macquarie Fields. That's what I experience when I'm running. That is part of the story of my run. The overview is not part of the story, nor is it even possible to precisely identify pieces of the story in the overview, because in the overview, everything's piled up on top of itself in relation to time. The overview is not about time, but in the case of the Bible, about God's eternal plan. All right, now I've tried to explain a little bit what I mean by this out-of-time prologue. That is like, it's this overview that's not part of the narrative story. And in principle, Creation Week could be something like that. Now, I want to look at some evidence from the New Testament that makes me think that, in fact, that is the nature and purpose of the text of Creation Week. I've got 3 New Testament prologues that I would dearly love to kind of unpack for you. 2 at the opening of John's Gospel, believe it or not, strangely. 2 of them in John's Gospel, and the 3rd one at the beginning of Matthew. But alas, time will, I think, preclude us from getting to all 3 of them. I dare say we'll have a go at one and see how we get along with that. But one at least should demonstrate in principle the point that I am trying to make. Okay, but let's start with the opening of John's Gospel. It's well recognized this is a sort of prologue kind of thing. So that's just the first few verses up there on the screen. If you got a Bible, you can look at the whole thing in your seat on your phone. So this is our first prologue. The 3 most important points to note are, number 1, John is referring explicitly to Creation Week. That's, I don't think, in doubt. Number 2, his prologue is not part of the narrative history of his gospel account. And 3, he is retelling the story through the lens of Jesus' relationship to creation. Okay, so for point 1, I think it's uncontroversial to say that John's referring to Creation Week, but it's more than a brief reference, right? I mean, there's the opening phrase, but then we see the Word, and we see the light, and we see the life. We see the creation of all things. We see the coming into the world of the true human being, and the multiplying of God's people through faith in the Word. So very much a kind of retelling of Creation Week. I think point 2 is equally uncontroversial. The account begins and ends in heaven with God. It recounts notable historical events along the way, but it is entirely self-contained and something separate from the narrative of the gospel. Verse 18 does not flow in time into verse 19. That's what I mean by out-of-time prologue. Okay. All right, so that's just a picture of verse 18 and verse 19. One not flowing into the other. Now, on point 3, and the retelling of Creation Week through the lens of Jesus, John's prologue gives us a snapshot of all of salvation history, highlighting his newfound understanding of the centrality of Jesus. And John is happy to retell Creation Week not as 7 days of history, but as the entirety of history with Jesus at the center. There's a movement through the passage. Jesus with God at the beginning, Jesus then comes into creation, and by verse 18, Jesus is back in the bosom of the Father, as it were, at rest. And you can see a kind of, a bit of a picture of how this works. The left-hand side is, your left-hand side is the beginning of the passage, and it kind of flows through Jesus into the world, and then the central idea is the idea that we become children of God by believing in Jesus, and then it builds back out to heaven again, and Jesus in heaven with the Father. And interestingly, though, that central idea is the very purpose for which John writes his gospel. In chapter 20, verse 31, he says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so you can see how this passage kind of works, the structure of this passage. And interestingly, another nod to Creation Week here, there are actually 7 pairs of ideas in that sort of figure of the passage that then focus on this one idea of salvation in Christ in the middle. All right, now, I think that's going to do us for prologues. Please ask me about ask me this. Ask me why the wedding at Cana takes place on the 3rd day in chapter 2 of John's Gospel. Okay, good. All right, excellent. Problem solved. Now, there's one final piece of what I want to say from this idea about being an out-of-time prologue fulfilled in Jesus, and that's from the book of Hebrews. Now, up to this point in the book of Hebrews, we're looking at Hebrews 2, verse 5, And up to this point, the author's been comparing angels to the Son of God, right? And saying how the Son has been given authority to rule, not the angels. We need to listen more carefully to the Son than to the revelation that Israel had through the angels, which in that context is the Mosaic Law. Things then get interesting in 2 verse 5, because the author says it is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. So he's talking about Jesus ruling over creation like is pictured in Creation Week, but he says this is the world to come. And then he goes on to quote Psalm 8, showing how God crowns humanity with glory and honor. And the author makes the point, well, we don't see humanity, us, hacks, ruling over creation, but we see the true human, Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of Man, ruling over creation. But Psalm 8 is, of course, a direct reflection of Genesis 1 and the creation of humanity to rule God's world. And the author of Hebrews then is saying that the picture of humanity ruling creation in day 6 of Creation Week is more properly understood as a picture of Jesus, the only true human, ruling the world to come. But now, just in case, we want to say that Adam might have done a proper job of living out day 6 for, a month or two before things turned sour, the author of Hebrews continues. How is it that Jesus is crowned with glory and honor? What is the necessary path for the person who will successfully fulfill God's command? Oops, sorry. All right. I'm stuck in... There we go. Thank you. Sorry, right. Verse 9, the bottom quote there. What's the necessary path for the person who will successfully fulfill God's command? We see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. The New Testament not only understands and uses Creation Week as a summary of salvation history, but seems to say also that it is necessarily so, since Adam was never fit to be the human of day 6. It was only the Son of God who would die for the sins of the world who would ever successfully fulfill that role. Before Jesus, day 6 was not achieved in human history for even an hour, but was gloriously fulfilled in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And of course, we've already seen this in God's plan A. Now, the New Testament never treats Creation Week as the in-time beginning to history. It only treats it as an out-of-time theological prologue fulfilled in Jesus, a promise, a prophecy. There is the third premise of my argument. And the proposal was this. Remember, the story of the Bible is the in-time revelation of God's eternal plan depicted in Creation Week. That was built on these three premises there. God has an eternal plan. Creation Week is narratively distinct from what follows. And Creation Week is this out-of-time prologue depicting God's eternal plan. So what we see in Creation Week is not God creating stuff with history following on from there. What we see in Creation Week is God creating history with God's rest following on from there. That is, Creation Week is not the physical stage where then human history is played out. It is human history, all of human history, in one image. God does not create this where I can then go for a run. God creates this, which I then experience when I go for a run. Now, we need to look at the implications of this understanding of Creation Week. Okay. I think the two most significant implications that arise from Creation Week being this idea of a picture of God's eternal plan and not the opening 7 days of history are, first, that the Bible then gives us really no hard start to the history of the universe. And second, that there is no word given about the goodness of the physical creation other than when viewed as the completed eternal reality of creation week. Okay, so first, the issue of timing and history. If Genesis 2 is the beginning of biblical history, then we pick up the world in progress, as it were, without fanfare. The Bible is then completely agnostic about what happened on the earth before Genesis 2, verse 4. We can still ask how long ago Adam was created on the earth, but what we would be unable to ask is how long had the earth been around before Adam was created. Okay, and the second issue is goodness, the goodness of creation. Am I saying that creation is not good? No. Am I saying that the Bible never says that creation is good? No. Creation is good. Creation Week makes that point unequivocally. There can be no doubt whatsoever that we are meant to understand that whatever God created is good. 1 Timothy 4, for example. Now we can have a discussion, of course, about what we mean by the word good, and that could be a useful discussion. But that's actually not my point here. The important question raised for us by my proposal is not what the word good means, but what the word creation means. And what I've been trying to indicate is I believe creation we see in Creation Week is the creation of all of history in one extended image. It is not a picture of a good beginning like our earlier diagram had it. The result of God's creative act is not so much stars and planets, but history itself. It is history that is good. It is God's eternal plan that is good. It's the completed reality that is good, but the world we all grew up in is on a journey, groaning in the pains of childbirth, awaiting the revelation of the children of God to finally bring creation to its fulfillment and be liberated from its bondage to decay. The world of Genesis 1, of Creation Week, is unambiguously good, but that is the sum total of history, the perfected eternal plan that we see there. The world of Genesis 2, on the other hand, is simply ambiguous. We're presented with a world that could be described as a renovator's dream, especially when juxtaposed to the hopefulness of Creation Week. Now, okay, this picture of an ambiguous world raises other questions, and probably the most important is this. If the world in which Adam took his first breath is not at least unequivocally and exhaustively good, then what exactly is Adam's relationship to the state of the world we experience today? Adam sinned, but what effect did it have on the world? What does God's curse mean if it didn't turn a good world into a bad one? Now, as I outline my answer to these questions, it's worth noting some points that seem to be fairly solid stakes in the ground from the rest of the Bible. You can read them there. First of all, Adam sinned in human history. He really did sin at some point in the history of our world, and it was the original human sin dragging all of humanity into rebellion against God. And secondly, Adam's sin is the cause of the spiritual and physical death of every human being who has ever lived. And thirdly, God's curse changed the world. Okay, so here's our question, though. What is Adam's relationship to the nature of the world we experience today? And just hang on, we're landing the plane. The short answer is that there is a direct logical and theological relationship between the sin of Adam and the state of our world. Adam is responsible for our experience of suffering and death and our unescapable tilt toward rebellion against God. Now, the slightly more complicated piece of that answer is that the way God reveals that eternal reality in our historical timeline means that some of the logical relationships don't have corresponding temporal relationships. Okay, hang on, I'll attempt at least to explain what I mean. Let's just start by recalling three S's from God's eternal plan. We remember that sin and sacrifice and subduing of the earth were all part of God's eternal plan. The first two are two sides of the same coin. Jesus was chosen to die for sin, so sin and his sacrifice for sin were always part of the plan. The third point is also simple and obvious. Creation Week itself tells us that the world needs subduing. And the ambiguity of the world of Genesis 2 reinforces that point, even though the precise nature of the sort of deficit and subduing is not made clear. But ultimately, God's plan shows Jesus as the one who will finally subdue creation. How then do these pieces of the plan get worked out in history? Well, okay, first of all, I just need to, we need to look at a couple of examples of temporal disjunctions between eternal realities and historical events. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a list just to let them wash over you. They're all familiar things, but you may not have reflected on them. So first of all, God says Adam will die in the day he eats the fruit. Well, does he? Well, of course he does. And yet, no, obviously he doesn't. That is, his spiritual death occurs immediately, but his physical death comes some hundreds of years later. Those outside of Christ are dead in their sins, but are still very much alive on the earth. Those who are in Christ are currently seated in the heavenly realms where Christ is with God. But I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm standing here in Melbourne at the moment. Those who believe in Christ have eternal life now, but my body, I assure you, is on a one-way ticket to the grave, despite my attempts at exercise every now and again. Jesus can say in John, "He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Abraham was declared righteous because of the sacrifice of Jesus that happened 2,000 years later. God can be just even though he passes over sin for thousands of years. All suffering and death can be traced to Adam's sin at a particular point in the timeline of human history. What the Bible seems less interested in detailing is the temporal relationship between Adam's sin and the ambiguous creation that needs subduing. That is to say, in God's eternal plan A, the logical relationship between Adam's sin and the brokenness of creation, including death, does not need to entail a particular temporal relationship. The ambiguity of the world of Genesis 2 and beyond could be simply because it's already feeling the effects of Adam's sin. In fact, that could be the reason for the need to subdue creation in the first place. The temporal cross-section through God's eternal plan that we call history has sin and grace built in at every point. Theologically, nothing changes. Jesus is the antidote to everything that Adam bequeathed to humanity and to creation. That is the logic of the eternal plan. But what about the temporal relationship? One way to picture the difference between the logical and the temporal connections between Adam and sin and Jesus and salvation is with an ellipse. Of course, that was what you thought. That was your immediate thought. Now, it's not perfect, but it might help, okay? So the New Testament sometimes describes Adam and Jesus as two poles of history, the first Adam, the last Adam, that sort of thing. Now, you all remember your high school maths well enough to know that the relative position of the two foci of an ellipse determine the shape of the ellipse, right? So Adam and Jesus, on that scheme, determine the shape of God's plan. Remember that sin and the death of Jesus and the perfection of creation in Christ were all part of Plan A. When you look at the ellipse as the single image of all history, that is God's plan A, it's clear that no matter where you are in that ellipse, wherever you are in God's plan, no matter how you take a cross-section of that, what you experience in history includes the sin of Adam and the salvation of Jesus. That is, the shape of the ellipse is dependent on those 2 points. Now, if you're more of a baker, perhaps the chemistry of a cake is a better way of thinking about it. With every bite of that lovely chocolate cake, right, you experience all of the ingredients: the butter, the sugar, the flour, and the cocoa. Okay, so just as Hebrews tells us that only in Jesus will the true human finally rule over God's creation, so the need for Jesus to subdue creation in the first place is the result of Adam's sin. The point is that the eternal plan takes place in eternity, out of time. God is not unjust to pass over sins because the sacrifice of Jesus is an eternal reality. The creation needs subduing because the sin of Adam is an eternal reality. Every element of God's plan contributes to the shape of the plan and therefore our experience of it in history. History is our time-bound experience of God's eternal plan. Adam's sin is directly responsible for the state of the world, even the state of the world before he was created in time. Jesus dies for that sin, and he heals creation from that decay. So what are you going to take home from here? Creation Week is a picture of God's eternal plan A. The Bible, as a subpoint there, is agnostic about the age of the universe. The Bible is agnostic about the goodness of the original creation. And for my first mention of evolution and last, the story of evolution could, in fact, potentially resonate naturally within that agnosticism about timing and goodness. But the second major point there, the historical cross-section of God's plan A is impacted at all stages by every element of the plan, including sin and grace, and the Bible narrative is internally consistent even when Creation Week is not understood as the beginning of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis, for sharing your thoughts from a long-age perspective. Now it's time for deliberation, so I'd like to invite both speaker and Martin to take a seat. Thank you. Oh, that's fine. Oh, yeah. Good. And I'm very pleased to see there are some questions flowing through and continue to flow through the questions. Testing. All right. Okay. All good. Very well. Now, Martin and Louis, can both of you briefly explain the term young Earth and long age for our audience, because some of us might not familiar with the term. So a simple term to help us understand what does that mean.
Sure. Am I audible? Can everyone hear me? Am I audible? Should I use your one?
Yeah, use mine.
Thank you. That's true. So my talk was presupposing a young Earth framework. I didn't explain that, so now's a chance to do that. As a young Earth creationist, I guess, I believe that the Earth was created in 6 literal 24 hours a day. I'm not dogmatic, I don't demand that from others, but to me that seems to be the plain meaning of Genesis chapter 1. Young Earth creationists normally believe that the Earth was created between 6 and 12,000 years ago. I lean towards 6,000. Based on my reading of the biblical genealogies, even William Lane Craig, who holds to theistic evolution and in his latest book on the historical Adam, agrees with me on the genealogies. He just thinks they're a myth, is what he says in his book. Young Earth creationists believe that Noah's flood occurred about 2,300 years BC, and that most of the rocks and the sedimentary layers and the fossils that we dig up in our world come from that time. Some before, and then of course also some after in more localized catastrophic floods. We believe that all land animals and many sea animals or creatures also died during Noah's flood. And those that were on the ark, we believe, are the ones that have led to the biological diversity we see today in the animal kingdom. So does that explain where I'm at? Is that
I think that's
concise
sufficient.
enough? And, yeah.
Well, it works for me.
Okay.
What about Louis?
Okay, thanks. So the long age perspective often, well, okay, I mean, it is what it sounds like, and I guess there's different sort of long ages, sort of scientific sort of long ages that would be kind of assumed to be part of that. But there's also then the question of what you do with Creation Week as part of that kind of explanation. But the kind of scientific sort of long ages, would be this kind of evolutionary time scale of billions of years. Or a geological time scale, again, of billions of years. on the Earth, or an astronomical cosmological time scale of 13.8 billion years for the age of the universe. So the long ages are we're talking about those kind of ages, billions of years. And from the point of view of understanding that within the framework of the Bible, I guess you could say I've presented one possible way of thinking about that this morning. But to be honest, I'm an outlier. The traditional sort of long age perspective from the Bible is that the days of Genesis 1 are represent long ages. And so, the kind of, the first day you get the kind of switching on of stars in the local neighborhood, that sort of thing. But the atmosphere of the earth is opaque, and so on. And then just the gradual unfolding of what, I guess, you sort of mainstream university kind of science perspective would be on the way the Earth evolved over time. 4.5 billion years is the presumed age of the Earth, and so you see those stages through the days of Creation Week, basically, and that the day just represents a long time. That's one kind of regular way of people thinking this through and fitting it in with the Bible's picture. And they're, I'm not a big fan of that. I agree with Martin. I think when Moses wrote Creation Week, when he said there was evening and morning the second day or whatever, I mean, sounds to me like a 24-hour day. So I don't really, I don't kind of see how that kind of works itself out. I don't think different uses of the word day in other parts of the Bible mean really have anything. Anyway, so that's my view on that. But then like another sort of quirky long age view is John Lennox's view in his book 7 Days That Changed the World. He says that each individual day of creation is itself a 24-hour day in Creation Week, but they're not consecutive. So you've got, a billion years or so, and then the first creation day, and then another couple billion years, and then the other day where God does something and sort of sets things running that way, and so on. So there are different ways of reading it, but it's basically just a way of getting what people think of as the scientific ages into the Bible, basically. Yeah.
Well, it seems like there's different view even within the long age view. Okay. So, Martin, I'm keen to get your thoughts on one of the main points from Lewis about the Creation Week, that Genesis 1 through to Genesis to chapter 2, verse 3 is distinct from what followed in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. So do you see there's a distinction, or do you see that there's two different creation narrative within the Genesis creation narrative?
Yeah, I believe there is development, and within that you could perhaps see distinction. The comment was made that Genesis 2:4 following does not dovetail into 1:1 to 2:3. I don't agree with that point simply because that's not the way the word toledot is used in Genesis. The Hebrew word toledot is the word we translate in the expression, this is the generations of, or this is the history of. It's translated into Greek as biblios genesios. You get the word book of the Genesis. It's the word we see in Matthew chapter 1. However, the way the word toledot is used in Genesis, and it's used 10 times as we saw on Lewis's wonderful slide, and it structures all of Genesis beautifully. What this word does is it harks back to the previous narrative, it does dovetail into it, and it develops it. It tells us what became of that. So, for example, one of the examples that Lewis put up on the screen was, if I remember rightly, Genesis 11:27. This is the generations of Terah. Now, following that, we don't have a genealogy of Terah. We have the narrative of Abraham, who is the son of Terah. And that narrative then goes right through to Genesis 25:11, if I'm right by memory. So what happens is then, we find out now what happens What becomes of what went before? What becomes of Terah's family? What becomes of his genealogy? And so we have the Abraham one, it develops it. So when we have in Genesis 2:4, this is the Toledot, this is the generations or the history of the heavens and the earth. Now what the writer does, he takes what's been said in Genesis 1 and now says, well, what became of that? And so the narrative is now developed. And this is how it works all the way through Hebrew. What became of God's perfect world? And so one of the little developments we see is that in Genesis 1, God is referred to by the Hebrew name Elohim. It's the name that's given to him when we speak of him as the creator. When we come into Genesis chapter 2, it changes from Elohim to Yahweh, or Yahweh Elohim. That's God's covenant name. And now God is going to enter into a relationship, a covenant relationship, in which there will be a mandate, there will be a curse and a blessing. That's why the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is there. God will now enter into a covenant relationship. And so God's covenant name is used. And so now the question's asked, what's now become of God's good creation? What's become of God's man and woman that he created? Well, now he will enter into a covenant relationship with them. They will break covenant relationship. And that will lead to the catastrophe that Genesis chapter 3 narrates. And we see that all the way through Genesis 10 times. The Hebrew word toledot is used. And what it does, it advances the narrative. It doesn't begin something totally new. It dovetails into what goes before and says, well, what became of this? What happened to this? Let me now tell you. And so in tying all of Genesis together, that would then suggest that from Genesis 1:1 right through to chapter 50 is all historical narrative. We can't just begin history at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. Rather, Genesis 2:4 takes the history of chapter 1 and says, now what became of this history? What happened next? How did the story develop after this? So we only have one creation narrative, but then we have that developed, and we're told now what became of this good creation. And then what was God's plan to do about that? Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman would one day come and crush the seed of the serpent. And so the narrative then develops now as we begin looking forward to that historical seed.
Thanks. Louis, do you have any further thought on that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, how long do we have? No, well, yeah, so, I mean, I guess one thing I'd say is that in terms of the way Toledot is used, I don't particularly have an argument about that, although, interestingly, that it is the first word of Matthew's gospel. So it is the beginning of something with no, in a sense, previous referent at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. And so I guess I'm just saying it's not necessarily as simple as you know, always referring to something earlier or something, you know, how it works out in practice. No, that's all. Yeah.
That's good, yeah. Now, both of you talk about physical death and spiritual death. So Martin, you argue that the long age evolutionary view, physical death doesn't come from sin, but from creation. So Louis, you agree Adam's sin is the cause of the spiritual and physical death of every human being who possibly lived. So do I sense there's agreement here between the two of you?
It sounds like it. I mean, yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think so. I don't have any argument with Martin's points about those things and the key elements of the gospel. Yeah.
Yes, I'd agree. And I think that's the one thing Lewis and I have both been saying, is that physical death and spiritual death are a result of the fall. God's imposed curse upon Adam and all of creation for his disobedience. So I think, yes, we've both definitely said that, and that then sets up the need for the gospel, that Jesus in his death will now absorb that curse. That curse will be placed on him, and through his death, the curse then will be lifted from all those that trust in him. And just as Adam fell and creation fell with him, so Romans 8:21-23 says that when humans rise in resurrection, the creation will together rise and our redemption will be together because of that harmony, that oneness that we do have with creation.
Awesome. So this is a perfect, good example that different views coexist. Now, on the subject of agreement, are there any other common view that both of you agree on? Because both of you attended the Presbyterian denomination church. And is your difference in young earth and long view a hindrance, or it is a non-factor when it comes to serving in the church at large?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, you know, church polity-wise, that's a complicated question, I guess. But there is no real, there's no hindrance in my context at all from either, holding either view. I mean, we could talk more about in principle and at level of charter documents and so on and things like that. But no, in actual practice, there's no hindrance in my context.
It's probably a little bit different in my context. I'm a lecturer at a Reformed theological college, and we're not allowed to hold to a long-age view of the earth or to theistic evolution. We allow a little bit of wriggle room on the days of creation, but we don't allow for an old earth. In the church, more broadly, it's a bit different. And we do argue over the Westminster Confession, which says that God created the earth in the space of 6 days, and we have endless debates over what the space of 6 days is. What I would say, at least from the variety that I see in my denomination, based on my talk, I wouldn't go around. I've said today that an apostolic understanding of the gospel is grounded in a biblical worldview, an understanding of the biblical story as I've laid it out. Now, not everyone in my denomination would necessarily agree with me. Now, I'm not going to run around saying, well, because you're an evolutionist, you're destroying the gospel, you're undermining the gospel, you don't believe the gospel I believe in. I can't do that, because that's not true. Probably what the most I'd say about it is I'd say there's a bit of cognitive disjunction there, that most of the people I know that are evolutionists in my denomination or hold to an old earth believe the same gospel as me, but they also hold to long ages or evolution, and I don't think they've really cottoned on to the implications of that for the gospel and really thought about that. So that's why I use the word cognitive disjunction. The two don't really fit together. Most people in my denomination perhaps haven't really thought about that, and that's one of the things I'm trying to help them do. So I'm not going to run around condemning them because they believe in evolution, even though I think it is, you know, you've heard my concerns this morning, but I think a lot of people just haven't thought about the implications of what happens when you place the gospel in an evolutionary story. And because they haven't really thought about it, I'd say that most of them, their gospel is the same gospel I preach.
Awesome, thanks for that. Now, we have an array of questions coming through our audience, so I'll just pick out a few. The first one probably for you, Martin. So it's about spiritual and physical disease or death. So are you able to comment about the spiritual disease that may lead to spiritual death, not physical death? Leading on to that, comment about the spiritual disease, sickness of the spirit, not the physical death. But this will lead on to the next question, which is also related to death. There's lots of interest in that. So from a pure ecological point of view, God's creation of the world needs to be sustainable, which means death is required to keep populations in check and sustainable. So what do you say to the idea that death is a part of the nature, and death as the wage is a premature before we can reach to our full potential?
Well, firstly, by spiritual death, we're talking, that's really symbolized in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. A very typical picture in the New Testament, in the Bible. Israel are exiled from the land. Cain is exiled from the land. Again and again, we see exile as punishment, right until we get to Revelation and 1 Thessalonians as well, and we see that people are exiled from the land. The Old Testament land points to the new heavens and new earth, from which those who are not part of that will be exiled, cast into outer darkness. So part of that being exiled from the land is being removed from the presence of God, removed from relationship with God. So I see spiritual death as being removed from relationship with God, no longer able to enjoy communion, fellowship with God, no longer able to enjoy a relationship of happiness and joy and love and delight. Now we hate God. Now we run from God. Now we no longer love God and want to serve God. So in Genesis chapter 3 then, when God threatens death, death comes in an inaugurated manner. Spiritual death comes first, and that's followed some years later on by physical death. And that's a merciful thing. God doesn't bring physical death straight away. He allows room for redemption. He allows space for grace. And then we see the same thing when it comes to salvation. Our eternal life, as Lewis pointed out, but didn't use this language, is inaugurated. It comes spiritually first, and then at the end of the age, we enjoy the completion of that through physical resurrection. Now, the second question was about, if there was no death, would the world be overpopulated? That's a good question. Well, we do know, at least at an ecological level, that when animal populations do become very dense, that they do naturally regulate, and they do stop giving birth. And so there are no real examples around our world yet where there is a case of overpopulation. Okay, there is death there, we'll come back to that. So we do know already that animals can self-regulate or naturally regulate, and they will slow down the birth rate if populations do become very dense. Now, my assumption is, and I'll give the reasoning for that, is that the same thing would have happened if there was no death. That God gives the mandate: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Well, what happens when it's filled? Did he say cram it full, overpopulate it until there's no room to move? The assumption then would be then that when the earth is filled, that we would no longer continue to populate it. Now, where do we get that idea from? Well, there's a hint of that in Mark's Gospel when Jesus is debating with, I think it's Mark's Gospel, is it? Debating with the Sadducees. And they're debating over the resurrection. And this woman who's had many husbands from different brothers, whose husband will she be in the age to come? And Jesus points out to her, there will be no marriage in the age to come. We won't be given to marriage. There won't be procreation. So if that is the goal of history, then that goal would seem then to have been built into creation, that hypothetically, had Adam not fallen, at the point where they reached the goal of filling the earth, that end-time goal, we call it an eschatological goal, an end-time goal, that we would no longer be given to procreating anymore. And so it would stop, the earth would be fulfilled, Adam would have reached his God-ordained goal, and there wouldn't be the need for having any more children, because that is exactly the goal we see in the new heavens and new earth. That will then cease, and the marriages that we enjoy now have really one overarching purpose. My role as a husband is to prepare my wife for her more important marriage, which is to Jesus Christ and not me.
That's good, thanks. Anything to add, Louis?
Yeah, I guess. Oh boy. So
otherwise,
I've
got the same topic. We can stay on the topic of death.
Okay.
It's
death.
very similar.
All right.
Seems like a
Sure.
very interesting.
Sure.
Now, with your view of eternal realities, would you say death and sickness before Adam are God punishing in terms of act of sins within the time?
Right. So, yeah. So I think the answer is yes to that. I just make sure I understand the question. So if the question is asking, is all sin and death and disease the punishment of God for Adam's sin, then my answer is yes. That's the short answer. I guess one thing I was going to possibly say on the animal death question is that one of the question marks I think that I have, and again just exegetically, is when God promises Adam that he will die, right? He makes no comment about death in general. There is no comment about death in general, right? God says, in the day you eat of it, Adam, you will die. And so when Paul in Romans 5 refers to death entering the world through one man, through sin, through one man, I take it he's referring to Genesis 2, where God promises Adam that he will die. And so I take it that is actually a promise about human death. Now, I'm not saying that I know that that therefore means X, Y, and Z for animal death. I'm simply saying that I don't think we have a kind of direct word about the world and animal death. We have a direct word about human death, and which again is primarily because it's about a relationship with God, and which is what the Bible is trying to tell us about.
That's good. Anything to add?
Can I add to that question then? Under a long age scenario, there is a belief that there are at least human precursors to Adam for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, if Adam's sin caused the curse to be applied retroactively to before Adam, here's a chicken and egg question. Adam's then born into a fallen world and therefore fallen. So does Adam fall because he's already fallen? Or is he fallen because he falls? Because the problem seems to be that Adam, if it's applied retroactively, then Adam's already born into a fallen world. And actually, God has guaranteed that Adam will fall, not so much because Adam sins, but because God has caused Adam to be born into a fallen world because he foresaw that Adam would fall. And then when God would threaten Adam, say, Adam, the day you do this, you'll die. And surely Adam would say, well, so what? My grandfather's already died, my father's died, and I'm going to die anyway. So do we have that sort of problem with a retroactive view?
It's open questions.
Well, I appreciate the point. I guess I don't think that's what I'm saying is that is what I'm saying is I think the historical outworking of God's plan is what it is, and it takes into account the eternal realities. Whether what you can point to in history as being those moments, those special moments, we can point to those special moments in history. Adam does fall. However, because the Bible tells us that's what happened, and tells us that the consequences of that were flowed on from that. But it's also true. I mean that God creates Adam. And then, and again, this is just, the kind of details of the way the Bible tells the story, then places him in the garden. And the garden is, now I don't know, we're not told, right? We're not given specifics, but it is a special place. I mean, I don't know whether it's a bio bubble like we had, or whatever, right? I don't know, right? But it is a special place. It is the only place where you can access the tree of life. It is a place where you can put a seraphim at the door and keep people out, right? It is a special place. It is some kind of quarantine. Now, in what way it's a quarantine, I don't know. Okay, but it could be that it solves this particular sort of logical quandary that Adam is created outside the garden in a world that is feeling the effects of his sin, placed in the garden, and then history flows on from there. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is the Bible seems to allow that as an entirely likely possibility.
Well, that's good. Well, suppose we have time for one questions before we break for lunch. Now, how do holders of the young Earth view or reconcile the large amount of scientific evidence that support a much longer age of the Earth? Does the young Earth views imply a belief that all such scientific evidence is false?
That's a really tricky question to answer without being given
just before lunch as well.
the evidence to respond to. I'm wondering what lush evidence is there. Say, for example, after lunch, I'll hopefully address one of those issues of lush evidence, and we'll be talking about the issue of natural selection and whether evolution by natural selection and mutation is an effective enough mechanism for creating the biological diversity we see all around us. Is it an effective enough mechanism to take a relatively simple single-celled microbe and suddenly from that bring about all of the biological diversity? Well, after lunch I'm going to say no. I'm going to give a reason for that. Perhaps another thing I could say too, well, I could say, well, where is the lush evidence for some of these intermediary links between dinosaurs and birds, between fish and amphibians? We've dug up hundreds of millions of fossils all around the world. Now, if evolution by natural selection, by slow, gradual mutation was a fact, then surely we would have more than just a small handful that could fit into a casket of ambiguous examples of intermediary links. And surely something that's an intermediary link that's neither one nor the other, that's neither adapted to either, say, land or sea, is going to be selected for extinction anyway. So I'd need to see the evidence too. How is it that an intermediary link that's not fully adapted is going to survive when for something to work, you need an irreducible amount of complexity? You don't just suddenly turn a bicycle into a car and hope that somewhere in between it's going to work. You build the bicycle from ground up, you build the car from ground up. It needs to have a certain amount of components to work properly. But not under the evolutionary scheme. You can have something that is transitioning from, say, a dinosaur to a bird that's neither a bird, neither a dinosaur, but somehow it's supposed to be functioning in such a way that it will survive in its environment and not be selected for extinction. Anyway, as I said, after lunch, I'm going to deal with the issue of natural selection by mutation, or evolution by mutation, which is sort of the real linchpin. This is the real mechanism for evolution, and I'm going to be explaining why it doesn't work, and actually going to not be doing it from creationist material, but I'm going to be doing it from my Australian biology textbook that my children have used at Melbourne University. And then we'll see if there's any lush evidence.
That's good, thank you. Anything to add, Luis?
No, that's fine. That's great.
Awesome. Well, there's some motivations for everyone to come back after lunch. Yes.
Advertisement.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, everyone for your time. I'm taken to send. Oh, sorry.
I just asked the audience a question. If you see a mobile phone sitting somewhere, I've dropped it somewhere. Thank you. It's black, but I'm sure all of yours is black too.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much. So now it's time for a lunch break. So please come back at 1:30 for part 2 this afternoon on science and Christianity. Now, there are 2 tables being set up in the dining hall that provides some of the reading material that's related to today's topic. That's provided by CMI, the Creation Ministry International, and Eastcast, Christians in Science and Technology. So I encourage everyone to visit those 2 tables, and they will also be available for the whole day. Thank you. We'll see everyone back at 1:30. Sorry, 1:30. Yep. Thank you.